today I want to give you just the yellow portions. Your homework will be to read the whole thing. This is a polemical book. Polemical means it's going to be controversial and we're going to go pick a fight. One of its main contentions is that contemporary analytic metaphysics, a professional activity engaged in by some extremely intelligent and morally serious people, fails to qualify as part of the enlightened pursuit of objective truth and should be discontinued. We think the current degree of dominance of analytic metaphysics within philosophy is detrimental to the health of the subject and make no apologies for trying to counter it. We hope the kind of metaphysic we construct here, one having as its sole aim to bring these hypotheses advanced by the various special sciences together into a comprehensive worldview, will go on being constructed by others for as long as science itself is carried out. For reasons to be explained, we take the view that no alternative kind of metaphysics can be regarded as a legitimate part of our collective attempt to model the structure of objective reality. We argue that a given metaphysics achievement of domestication in terms of common sense and familiarity and sense and psychological intuitiveness furnishes no evidence at all that the metaphysic in question is true, and thus no reason for believing that it explains anything. So what they mean by domestication is this. Let's go back here. See, there's a rich tradition of naturalistic metaphysics in Western philosophy, and competing strongly with this tradition. So naturalistic here would mean really influenced by natural science. Competing strongly with this tradition, often within the body of a single philosopher's work, is a tradition which aims at domesticating scientific discoveries so as to render them compatible with intuitive or folk pictures of structural composition and causation. Such domestication is typically presented as rendering more familiar. So what they mean by domestication here is making sure that the results of science kind of fit with common sense, right? Making it gel with our, what they call the manifest image of the world that you of tables and chairs and frogs and whatnot, right? So that's what they mean by domestication. Now they argue that a given metaphysics achievement at domestication furnishes no evidence at all that the metaphysic in question is true, and thus no reason for believing that it explains anything. So the fact that it's intuitive and fits with your common sense observations of the world, they're saying, who cares? Deep metaphors of English are structured according to an implicit doctrine of containment. On this usual doctrine, so here's the sort of worldview that folks normally have. The world is a kind of container bearing objects that change location and properties over time. These objects cause things to happen by interacting directly with one another. Prototypically, they move each other about by banging into one another. At least as important to the general picture, they themselves are containers in turn, and their properties and causal dispositions are to be explained by the properties and dispositions of the objects they contain. So this is a description of this kind of folk metaphysic that that Ladyman and Ross regard as kind of the default setting for common sense. The world is a kind of a container. There's things in it, these objects. The objects kind of hit each other. So your chair and me are hitting each other, right? My chair and me are hitting because the chair is lifting me up. I'm sitting on the chair, right? Those containers can be open, and inside them are little further small things, right? And then those things are containers and so on until you get to these kind of small little things. But everything is, the universe is a bunch of little things hitting each other, right? And some of the little things compose larger things, and they also hit each other and so on. And that's this picture of the world that they think is the one that's the common sense one. And they view some standard, normally metaphysics is the job of saying, how can science kind of fit with that worldview? I'm going to just read this one, even if it's not underlined, because I think it's helpful. It may thus be thought unsurprising that the earliest known Western philosophy puzzled itself over ways in which the apparently endless regress of containment might be stopped. So if you think each thing is made of little things, which is made of little things, how might this regress of containment might be stopped? Thales suggested that everything is ultimately made of water. Other philosophers suggested air and fire instead. Popular consensus eventually settled down for a long time on the idea that all corporeal things are made of mixtures of four basic elements: earth, water, air, and fire, with differences among kinds of things to be explained by references to differences in elemental proportions. Then science replaced the four elements with tiny, indivisible, ultimate particles, first early modern corpuscles, then atoms, then systems of subatomic particles, still often conceived in popular imagination as submicroscopic solar systems whose little stars and orbiting planets are supposedly the new ultimate constituents from which everything is composed. Thus, the ultimate constituents of the world that halt the regress of containment are also taken to be the ultimate bearers of causal powers, which somehow support and determine the whole edifice, often complex, of causal relations that constitute the domain of observable dynamics. The metaphysics of domestication tends to consist of attempts to render pieces of contemporary science, and, at least as often, simplified mythical interpretations of contemporary science, into terms that can be made sense of by reference to the containment metaphor. That is, it seeks to account for the world as made of, and notice they're putting this in parentheses, made of, myriad little things in roughly the way that some walls are made of bricks. Unlike bricks and walls, however, the little things are often in motion. Their causal powers are usually understood as manifest in the effects they have on each other when they collide. Thus, the causal structure of the world is decomposed by domesticating metaphysics into reverberating networks of what we will call micro-bangings amongst the basic types of little things, whatever exactly those turn out to be. We will argue that this is profoundly unscientific, and we will reject both the conception of causation and levels of reality upon which it is based. We will argue in this book that in general, the domesticating metaphysics of micro-bangings, which is their pejorative expression for this kind of vision of little particles hitting one another, finds no basis in contemporary science. Some successful science and some reasonable metaphysics were done in the past on the basis of it. However, the attempt to domesticate 21st century science by reference to homely images of little particles is forlorn. There are, we will argue, no little things and no micro-bangings. Remember, the title of the book is Everything Must Go. There are no things. There are no little things either, and no little micro-bangings between the little things. Causation does not, in general, flow from the insides of containers to their outsides. The world is in no interesting ways like a wall made of bricks in motions that somehow manages to not fall apart, or in the more sophisticated extension of the metaphor dominant since modern science, like a gas chamber enclosing the molecules of the gas. Indeed, it is no longer helpful to conceive of either the world or particular systems of the world that we study in partial isolation as made of anything at all. This is a really radical claim metaphysically. The whole idea that something is made of something, that's got to go. This is because the increasing heights of abstraction in representation achieved by science over the past century have now carried its investigations so far beyond the reaches of our ancestral habitation that a containment metaphor can no longer be applied to the scientific image without doing at least as much violence to everyday intuitions as does our denial of the metaphor. Much recent metaphysics, in trying to save a version of the habitual picture that has already been transformed by half-digested science, ends up committed to claims that are as at least as shocking to common sense as anything we will urge. For example, Trenton Merrick's, in his 2001 book, Objects and Persons, is led to deny the existence of tables and chairs because he thinks physics tells us that they decompose without residue into atoms, and he denies that baseballs can break windows because he thinks that windows must be broken by particular atomic constituents of a baseball, thus rendering the effects of the ball as a whole causally OTOs. According to the account we will give, science does not impugn the everyday status of objects like tables and baseballs. These are aspects of the world with sufficient cohesion that, at our scale, that a group of cognitive systems with particularly motivated interests in tracking them would sort them into types for bookkeeping purposes. So we're the cognitive systems and we still group tables and chairs and make sense of them, but they don't have the same place as the whole thing story. And our source of inspiration here is Daniel Dennett's 1991 article, Real Patterns, which I've added to the Moodle page if you want to have a look. So that's my insert here. So just so you know, that's where they're coming from when they say this technical sentence here, right? There are aspects of the world with sufficient cohesion at our scale that a group of cognitive systems with particularly motivated interest in tracking them would sort them into types for bookkeeping purposes. So that is a way for them to sort of recapture what it means to be a table and a chair, right? And the reason is because the reality will be made exclusively of patterns. There are no things. All there are patterns. Patterns. And that's actually a pattern ontology that I'm really sympathetic to and that I've quasi-defended in print, just so you know. So just to be clear, they're denying the existence of atoms. Yes. Yes, there are no little atoms. What you have are patterns, and patterns that contain information. This is going to be their positive view, and that science doesn't think of little things anymore. Atoms are same definition as a table and chair. Atoms are aspects of the world with sufficient cohesion at our scale, well, in this case, at a small scale, that a group of cognitive systems with particularly motivated interest in tracking them would sort them into types for bookkeeping purposes, right? Yeah, there are no atoms in the common sense notion of the term, and there are no tables and there are no chairs, right? Not in the sense of things. Everything must go, right? And if you sort of think that science still thinks in terms of little bits that are banging each other and account for the larger things we see, you're beholden to a mistaken picture, or so they argue, that science has long ago moved away from. People who wish to explore the ways in which the habitual or intuitive anthropological conceptual space is structured, that the world that we know from common sense, are invited to explore social phenomenology. Look, we can say go in peace to Heideggerians. Remember Heidegger? Noting that it was entirely appropriate that Heidegger did not attempt to base any elements of his philosophy on science and focused on hammers rather than atoms, right? Things as constituted as objects by situated practical activity, right? So that not unlike atoms, things that are supposed by realists to have their status as objects independently of our purposes when he reflected on objects. So we, however, are interested in objective truth rather than philosophical anthropology. So if you think of Carnap, right? Carnap was taking Heidegger to task for doing bad metaphysics. They're saying, look, Heidegger wasn't even doing metaphysics. Heidegger was describing social phenomenology. It was like, he's just describing, hammers and ordinary objects that we have practical dealings with, and go in peace. It's all good. Go ahead, do it. But you're not talking about objective truth or the nature of reality. So go ahead. So long as you don't pretend that you're basing this on science, you're not actually talking about reality. You're talking about human life, right? You can talk about human life. By all means, go ahead and do that, right? So if you want to keep talking about tables and chairs and hammers, go ahead. But you're not doing metaphysics. You're talking about human life. You want to do metaphysics, you got to do it through science, and you got to do it through the latest science. And the latest science does not talk about little things. So our quarrel will be with philosophers who claim to share this interest, in science, but then fail properly to pay attention to our basic source of information about objective reality. Our substantive claim is that the worthwhile work to be done by naturalistic metaphysics consists in seeking unification of the various sciences. So naturalistic metaphysics, for them, that's the good thing, right? Analytic metaphysics, bad. Naturalistic metaphysics, good. In their jargon, we got to be clear on that. So when they say naturalistic metaphysics, that's the good kind. If they say analytic metaphysics, that's the bad kind. And you might sort of make the distinction as follows, right? If you have analytic metaphysics, right? If it's analytic metaphysics, I'm sorry for the pun here, right? What you do is you sit in your armchair, right? And you think more. By analysis, you think more, right? And that's basically what we did in weeks 3, 4, and 5. We sat here and we thought more, right? What they call naturalistic metaphysics, right? Naturalistic metaphysics is you actually consult, right, the most recent science. That's all you do. And then you just accept it, the most recent science. You don't think harder, and there's nothing you could accomplish in the armchair. Like nothing. Nothing worthwhile, not even a little bit. So naturalistic metaphysics, good label. Analytic metaphysics, bad label. Completely different methods. Is that clear, everyone? All right, so they're still going to say that metaphysics can be a thing. But their substantive claim or positive claim is that the worthwhile work to be done by naturalistic metaphysics consists in seeking unification of the various sciences. Now, we admit that the hypothesis that metaphysics is possible is itself a metaphysical hypothesis. So they're not doing the same mistake as Carnap. Remember one of the things I said about Carnap? Carnap was doing metaphysics too. All the while that he was taking a poop on metaphysics and wrecking it with his wrecking ball, he was just doing metaphysics but not owning up to all his presuppositions. So they're like, look, we're not going to make the same mistake. We admit that the hypothesis that metaphysics is possible is itself a metaphysical hypothesis. Yet, even if naturalism, that is this sort of reliance on science, 100% reliance on science, depends on metaphysical assumptions, the naturalist can argue that the metaphysical assumptions in question are vindicated by the success of science. By contrast with the metaphysical assumptions on which autonomous metaphysics is based, which are not vindicated by the success of metaphysics, it can claim no such success, right? So it's like, okay, yeah, fair enough, I'm making metaphysical assumptions. It's true, right? So I've got like, well, if you assume this, then you step into this particular framework, and if you assume this, you step into this particular framework. Let me put naturalistic metaphysics over here, NM, and let me put analytic metaphysics over here, AN. And they're like, okay, I get that both make presuppositions, but you know, there's a big difference. The one on the left, it's got results. The one on the right, it's got none. So yeah, it's true. We're smuggling in metaphysical assumptions, but at least our metaphysical assumptions yield fruit. So you're asking yourself, should I be consulting science, then do naturalistic metaphysics, or should I sit in my armchair and spend a lot of time with philosophers and do analytic metaphysics? Yeah, well, it's true that both are going to make presuppositions about what the world is like. Metaphysics is inescapable, but at least this one bears fruit. Like something comes out of it. It bears fruit, right? F for fruit, like something happens, right? What comes out of this? Like nothing, like a big, fat, empty nothing, right? There's nothing happening here. So you pick. So they're going to own up to that. Is that clear, everyone? Like I'm kind of using Carnap language here, right? So the Carnap 1950s language about frameworks, like you're going to have to sort of assume certain things before you go into this game. And I say, it's true. We are going to sort of make presuppositions, right? So we admit that the hypothesis that our sorts of metaphysics is even possible is itself a metaphysical hypothesis. But like at least we get stuff done with our version. Metaphysics, the analytic type, can claim no such successes. It's interesting that this comes after Carnap, by the way. Notice they're not going to make the same mistakes as Carnap in many ways. They've learned their lesson, right? So it's a different story. And notice here, our core complaint is that during the decade since the fall of the school of thought once led by Carnap, much of what is regarded as the metaphysics literature has proceeded without proper regard for science. The logical positivists like Carnap believe that by reduction of all empirically significant statements to reports about sense data, they could do away with metaphysics altogether. In this ambition, of course, they failed, not least because one of their central working concepts, that of sense datum, is itself a scientifically unsupported one. Their understanding of empirical significance in terms of a verification-based theory of meaning was likewise a piece of metaphysics they did not derive from science. Although many philosophers inspired by Carnap regarded metaphysics as a relic of earlier ages, it never really ceased to be done, even by those who intended to avoid it. And here they do a bit of history. A key breakthrough in the rehabilitation of metaphysics came in the mid-1970s when Kripke's Naming and Necessity and a series of papers on meaning in science by Hilary Putnam convinced many philosophers to believe in both metaphysical reference relations and in the mind-independent reality of the objects of successful scientific theories. Thanks to Putnam and David Lewis, trips to possible worlds became standard instruments of philosophical argument. Now, initially, this sort of metaphysics, remember I made a curve. Remember I had done this curve and I said, look, it used to be that everyone was doing metaphysics and having a jolly old time. And then like Carnap came in like a wrecking ball and then everyone went into hiding. And then Carnap died. And then everyone started being like, can we come out yet? Is he gone? is he gone? And people started to come out, right? And then never sort of regained its normal vigor, but metaphysics resumed again, right? And Carnap was there for the fall over here. That's Carnap, right? So this dotted line here, that's Carnap. And then people start coming out like when Carnap dies, essentially, right? And Quine and a bunch of other people. And I had mentioned some names of people who were responsible for this early resurgence. And some of those names are Hilary Putnam, Sal Kripke, David Lewis, Willard Van Orman Quine, and so on. And they're thinking, yeah, this was kind of okay at the beginning, right? So initially, this sort of metaphysics, this one over here, right, the post sort of critique version of it, could be indulged in guiltlessly by philosophers who admired the positivists like Carnap because it was profoundly respectful of science. But what we eventually witnessed was a resurgence of the kind of metaphysics that floats entirely free of science. So if we were to put this again on our timeline, eventually you got to here. And by the time we got real confident, yay, mom and dad are not here, we broke out the vodka bottles and we started having a party. It's like, are mom and dad around? It's like, no, they left. Guess it's safe to come out. And then at the beginning, you're still scared, right? Because they might be there. But when you think it's safe and they're gone, then out the vodka bottles go, and then you go crazy in the houses. You invite your friends over for a party. And so what happened is that we eventually witnessed the resurgence of the kind of metaphysics that floats entirely free of science. And it's the more exotic metaphysics that we kind of tried in the first few weeks. The result has been the rise to dominance of projects in analytic metaphysics that now have almost nothing to do with actual science. Hence, there are now, once again, esoteric debates about substance, universals, identity, time, properties, and so on, which make little or no reference to science, and worse, which seem to presuppose that science must be irrelevant to their resolution. They're based on prioritizing armchair intuitions about the nature of the universe over scientific discoveries. Now, evolution has endowed us with the generic model or theory of the physical world. This is evident from experiments with very young children who display surprise and increased attention when physical objects fail to behave in standard ways. For example, if a ball moves behind the screen and then two balls emerge from the other side, or vice versa, infants are astonished. So there's a reason why we have this kind of common sense metaphysics, right? If you've done developmental psychology, any of you taken psychology in general and developmental psychology specifically? Okay, cool. So here's some experiments that, and this is, by the way, this has gotten, we're better at tracking this because of eye tracking tools have gotten more precise, right? Let me give myself a kind of a nice space to work in here where I don't have any clutter. If you show infants, like something like this, like it looks like a big space, right? And you have this other thing here, right? And then you can imagine this circle keeps going and keeps going. Let me kind of try to make motion here, right? Keeps going. And eventually, let's say it gets occluded behind this object here, right? Let me grab myself a pen, right? Like this, right? And you show this at a certain age, right? The children are, the dots I'm going to make right now, all the dots I'm going to make represent the kids' eye tracking. So where they're looking with their eyeballs. Let me make bigger dots than this. This is where these dots represent where the kids are looking. Kids are looking here, 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 wherever. They're looking all over. Infants are like this. So I've got 4 kids. I'm going to have a 5th one. Their eyes are all over the place, right, when they're young. They just don't know what to focus on, right? So you've got this purple ball that keeps going in this direction, and still they're just all over the place. They don't know what's going to happen next. At a certain age, though, let me do my undo. At a certain age, here's what happens. The little purple ball starts to go behind this, or it looks like it's going to go behind, because strictly speaking, all I've done are lines on the screen. Don't forget, so even the language I've just used, behind, nothing's behind anything right now. I'm making lines on a screen. Everything's 2D, right? But at a certain age, what happens is, you see this here coming in. So this is where your eyeball goes. And then your eyeball goes here. Why does your eyeball go on the other side? So the eyeball goes here. At a certain age now, instead of looking all over, your eyeball goes over here. So the second part of the eyeball goes at where I've written 2 here. Why do you think it does that? Earlier, it was all over the place. And as my sort of purple line is doing this, at a certain age, there's a sort of an expectation is formed and your eyeball goes there. In your own words, what do you think's just happened? It presupposes that something is behind that object. That's right. So one of the things is, once children develop their motor skills, now they've touched things. Like the first part of your life, you're lying on your back and you can't hold anything worth a damn. You've never touched an object. If you hand over a child an object at that age, they can't even hold it and it falls over. So your world is just vision, right? And if it's just vision, then all you're seeing, like earlier when I was doing these little sort of shapes, are just a bunch of shapes. Like, why should anyone care about shapes, right? Sometimes there's a shape here and sometimes there's a shape there. How interesting. But these are all like 2D things and they don't matter. But once you've had dealings with things with your hands, the sensory information you get from the 2D eyeballs, your eyes, and the 3D interaction with your hands, that information becomes coupled. Like all of a sudden you have data streaming into your brain, data that's not just coming from your eyeballs, but data that's coming from your hands. And all of a sudden, and Chris puts it nicely, it presupposes that the object is behind the other one, right? So when you have a situation where you see this thing and it's heading in this direction, right? And the next thing you see is it starts to disappear a bit, then your eyeball, and I've got my little red dot right now. Can everyone see the red dot of my marker? Type in yes if you can see it. Cool, thank you, Tani. All of a sudden your eyeballs go here because what are you expecting? Well, you're expecting this thing to vanish for a little while, right? And then come out on this side. And then you're expecting after that, right, for the whole thing to be revealed on the other side. And that's going to create a situation where you're going to give solidity to this blue shape. You're going to think this blue shape occludes this purple shape, that one came behind. And this is where the story about things begins, right? Our metaphysics of things begins at like 3, right? You begin to think of objects as having permanence and solidity, right? Because your senses are telling you this. But the idea is that this is a great story for a 3-year-old, but it's not a great story for us adults. Because what does science tell us? It doesn't tell us that, according to them, and I think they're probably right, if you look at the latest results of science, it's not like if you were to look really closely into this, right, what you would find if you kept zooming in would be more little solid things hitting each other in the manner that our macroscopic solid things hit each other. You're not going to find that. So the whole little thing story, it has a basis in fact for the experiential world of an organism that has to deal with these things, but that's not the ultimate nature of reality. The ultimate nature of reality as revealed by science doesn't even at all come close to conforming to that. That's a little aside that I wanted to make about this. Is that clear and helpful, everyone? If that's clear, if it's helpful, let me know. If you've got a question, ask your question. Evolution has endowed us with a generic theory of the physical world. Type in clear if that's clear question, if you've got a question. A little aside in developmental psychology here. That's where we became metaphysicians at 3. And we haven't moved past that. So this is what they mean by the micro bangings. Yeah, like this is where the micro bangings comes from. But the thing is, this picture has no justification in current science. There's nothing you can look at in current science that tells you that the world is made of a very small scale version of that rectangle and that square passing behind or hitting one another. There's nothing. If you keep zooming in with the particle accelerator, you don't get that. You get something that it doesn't even come close. Nothing has spatial extension, and like it's just it's energy and it's information flow. It's completely wild and esoteric, and they will admit weird. And like at the quantum level, like you're not finding any of this stuff. Chris, does that help? It's not like you can keep zooming in. Like, look, notice what I did. Like I zoom in and I zoom in and I zoom in and I zoom in. And we're expecting to see, like if we keep zooming in, that we're going to see the same world of tables and chairs. Like just at a very, very small level. And there's like, no, not even close, right? So they're giving a story for how these metaphysicians have this view. And it's essentially a childlike view, right? For example, if a ball moves behind the screen and then 2 balls emerge from the other side, and infants are astonished. Like, think about this, right? So if you had a situation like this, right, you have got your thing and you've got your little your balls coming here, right, and you're expecting one to come out on the other side, and you can imagine if 2 come out, kids are going to open their eyeballs. Like if you track their face, right, there's machines that can track this. Their eyeballs are going to open wide because you're preparing for a surprise. It's a stance of readiness for a hunter-gatherer like us, it's crucial that when something surprising happens, we sort of open our pupils, right? If two balls come out the other side, we're like, what the F, right? Because now we're expecting this. We've got a theory of the world, a folk metaphysics, right? And this childlike metaphysics was well suited to the atomist theories of Descartes, Boyle, Pierre Gassendi, and John Locke, right? So this was fine for a while. That's so for early modern science, it was great. This worldview, however, cannot be relied upon for an account of what is real. We experience events that last, we humans, right? We experience events that last from around a tenth of a second to years. So a tenth of a second is the smallest, and years. There's events that are about that scale. And our collective historical memory may expand to centuries, but no longer. Similarly, spatial scales of a millimeter to a few thousand miles are all that have concerned us until recently. Yet, science has made us aware of how protons, for example, have an effective diameter of around 10 to the power of minus 15 meters, while the diameter of the visible universe is more than 10 to the power of 19 times the radius of the Earth. The age of the universe is supposed to be of the order of 10 billion years. Also, our inability to grasp intuitively the vast timescales on which natural selection works is almost certainly crucial to the success of creationists in perpetuating foolish religious controversies about evolution. So essentially, the results of science now far outstrip our perceptual capacities. In fact, here they quote someone, I would almost contend that if something fits with common sense, it is almost certainly not science. It almost certainly isn't science. Metaphysicians place great emphasis on preserving common sense and intuitions. Yet such philosophers are often completely deluded when they claim that some intuition or other belongs to common sense. Not only are genuine common sense intuitions the product of cultural learning, but philosophers who have spent years training in their discipline do not share as many intuitions with the folk as they usually suppose. If you want to read up on that, read the literature in experimental psychology and experimental philosophy, right? We philosophers, we keep talking about, isn't it too intuitively obvious that such and such? And we say, surely such and such, but like we're an elite group of people and we don't have ordinary common sense intuitions. So not only are intuitions bogus, we have very strange intuitions as philosophers. Yet a common contemporary metaphysical methodology consists in subjecting rival hypotheses to a cost-benefit analysis. Usually there are two kinds of costs associated with accepting a metaphysical thesis. The first is accepting some kind of entity into one's ontology, for example, abstracta, possibilia, or a relation of primitive resemblance. The second is relinquishing some intuitions, for example, the intuition that causes antedate their effects, that dispositions reduce to categorical bases, or that facts about identity over time supervene on facts about instants of time. It's taken for granted that abandoning intuitions should be regarded as a cost rather than a benefit. By contrast, we naturalists are not concerned with preserving intuitions at all, and we argue for the total abandonment of those intuitions associated with the image of the world as composed of little things, and indeed the more basic intuition that there must be something of which the world is made. So this is interesting, right? When we did metaphysics, they're saying, like one standard way of doing metaphysics is you want to say, is this a good metaphysical theory? And then you do a cost-benefit analysis. And the costs are as follows. The bad things, the things you don't want that you're going to have to pay for your theory is the following, right? If it increases the number, like let's say Occam's razor, right? You want to be able to say, don't violate Occam's razor. So you want to be able to say that it posits as few things as possible. So if you're going to have more stuffs in your ontology, that's bad. That's one of the costs. And the other is you don't want to violate intuitions, right? So you'll accept a theory if you've got two theories, for instance, right? So let's call this theory 1 in metaphysics, and you've got this theory 2. And then you look at the cost, right? And you say, well, this one, theory 1, has, let's say, 3 stuffs in its universe, and theory 2 has 1 stuff in its universe, according to, I'll actually, let me call these letters because I'm using numbers here and it's going to get confusing. Call this theory A and call this theory B. Theory A has 3 things in its universe, 3 ontological stuffs. Theory B, one of its costs, it has 1 ontological stuff. According to Occam's razor, which theory ought you prefer, A or B? Great. B, of course, right? That's what Occam's razor tells you. And then let's say, for instance, let's say that theory one, let's say sacrifices, another cost is that, let's say these are our intuitions. 1, 2, 3, 4 intuitions. I stands for intuitions, and it destroys 2 of our intuitions. Whereas, let's say theory B, right? 1, 2, 3. We've stated 4 intuitions that we think are valuable, and it just does violence to one of them. Which of the theories ought you prefer, A or B? B. You got it, Chris. And that's kind of what we've been doing. If you read the metaphysics chapters that we were doing earlier, let me give you now another possibility, and then we get to these interesting situations that you wrote about in your entries, right? Here's another situation where you have a theory C. This is now a metaphysical theory C. Its costs as far as ontology are, let's say, it's got 2 stuffs in its world, and other costs as far as not Occam's razor, but as far as intuitions is, let's say, it does violence to none of our intuitions, right? And then, so which theory ought you to prefer? Yeah, exactly, Chris. You got it. Like, so now you've got 3 competitors, A, B, and C. A has 3 stuffs in its ontology, but does violence to 2 of our 4 core intuitions. B has 1 stuff in its ontology, but does violence to 1 intuition. C has 2 stuffs in its ontology, but it preserves all our intuitions. Which ought you to pick? A, B, or C? And basically, notice here, packing bags, going to see, who knows, right? But that's what you've been writing in your entries. I mean, think about what we were doing when we talk about persistence or something like that. That's all we did when we did metaphysics. We look at this theory, its pros and cons. We look at this theory, its pros and cons. And we look at this theory, its pros and cons. And you've been reporting in your entries your deliberations and cost-benefit analysis, right, of these theories. You've got multiple theories, right? And some of them presuppose more. Like, for instance, for the cost of presupposing that you're a worm, you get to explain, you get to solve the problem of the ship of Theseus. But you have to think of yourself as a spatio-temporal worm. All right, so it's like, well, that's ontologically bloated. So that's like in the first cost there, Occam's razor, like that's pretty crazy, right? I have to think of myself as a spatial four-dimensional worm. But look, I've solved a lot of other problems. And that's what we were doing, is we were bouncing around. Now I'm going to show you, let me just pause before I show you their view. Because everyone see now this kind of schematic representation? That's what we were doing when we were doing analytic metaphysics. If that's clear, type in clear. If you've got a question, ask your question. That's what we were doing. Metaphysically now, like if you think about it, that's what we were doing. We had costs associated with trying to keep our ontology sparse and not abundant. And then we were trying to rescue our intuitions. Right? Like, for instance, let me give you a concrete example of an intuition, right? You want to be able to say that you were the person you were when you were 7, right? That's an intuitively a thing you might want to hold on to. You want to say, Tanny is the Saint Tanny that celebrated, like if you're looking at, pictures and you were blowing your candles on your 7th birthday, you want to say, that's me. You don't want to say, that's another person, right? And you think that's one of those little bars there for intuitions. Well, if you sort of don't buy into a theory of persistence that allows you to say that, you're going to have to say that that's a different person, and you'll do violence to one of your intuitions, and you'll be like, damn, I just lost something. So now let me show you Ladyman and Ross's position. This is Ladyman and Ross's position. Who the hell cares? Who the hell cares? And who the hell cares? And then the question is, was this delivered by science? Was this delivered by science? Was this delivered by science? Can everyone see how drastic that view is in red? Type in clear if that's clear. Like, who the hell cares about the intuitions? And all this talk of stuffs, did that come from science? Recent science? It's like, who the hell cares? Like, between A, B, and C, look to your science, and who cares? Like, who cares about the intuitions? I think I'm explaining that pretty well. I'm kind of proud of myself. Like, I think my coffee's working good. Like, I think I find these diagrams to be at least really helpful, right? And Chris says clear, even if it's radical, as long as scientifically based, and it's right. Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. It's exactly right. Like, why should you assume the world makes sense to the mind of a 3-year-old. Like, why should this thing, so remember this, Chris? Hold on. Why should this thing, right? This thing, quite literally, the thing, right? Why should this stop your conception of reality forever? Like, who says reality has to fit that and not the other way around? Chris, does that make sense? Like when scientists are working, you go, tut, tut, tut. You're violating my 3-year-old folk metaphysics. Tut, tut, tut. Stop. Stop the particle accelerator. Exactly. We're going to get to quantum mechanics and quantum physics. It's like, you know, the particle accelerator in Switzerland. You go, hey, stop it, la. You're violating my, you know, the thing view, the little containing view. Like stuff is hard and hits each other and it's made of little stuff, right? So let me reread, now that we've done all this work, let me reread this one key passage. There's a lot of key passages. It was a real pain to try to trim everything because it's so packed. A common contemporary metaphysical methodology consists in subjecting rival hypotheses to a cost-benefit analysis. That's how you would say the common metaphysical approach. Usually there are two kinds of costs associated with accepting a metaphysical thesis. The first is accepting some kind of entity into one's ontology. The second is relinquishing some intuitions. For example, blah, blah, blah. It's taken for granted that abandoning intuition should be regarded as a cost rather than a benefit. By contrast, we naturalists are not concerned with preserving intuitions at all, and we argue for the total abandonment of those intuitions associated with the image of the world as composed of little things, and indeed the more basic intuition that there must be something of which the world is made. There's no one stuff. Here's an example. According to L.A. Paul, metaphysics proceeds by attempts to construct theories that are intuitive, commonsensical, palatable, and philosophically respectable. These criteria of adequacy for metaphysical systems have clearly come apart from anything to do with the truth. Intuitive, common sense, palatable, and philosophically respectable. Why should we assume that that tracks truth, they say? Rather, they're internal and particular to philosophy. They're semi-aesthetic, and they have more in common with the virtues of story writing than with science. You can see the echoes of Carnap here near the end of his 1932 paper, right? The reliance on intuitions in metaphysics often involves describing a situation that is intuitively possible and then concluding something important about the actual world from the existence of this possible world. For example, Ted Sider tells us that it is clearly possible to imagine a world consisting of matter that is infinitely divisible. Surely there is a gunk world in which some gunk is shaped into a giant sphere? Surely, they cynically ask. Lowe, E. Jonathan Lowe tells us that it seems that an individual material sphere could exist as a solitary occupant of space. He goes on, certainly, it seems that any satisfactory ontology will have to include self-individuating elements, the only question being which entities have this status, space-time points, bare particulars, tropes, and individual substances all being among the possible candidates. Certainly, none of these obvious elements of reality, including the pseudoscientific space-time points, are known to either everyday intuition or science. As Gilmore puts it, the philosopher faces the dragons and the labyrinth of metaphysics, armed only with words and a good imagination. It's a pretty nasty quote. It's kind of like Carnap, right? It's just a complete demolition job. Even the intuitions of the greatest scientists are regarded by other scientists as merely useful, but not evidentially valuable. So we do not deny that intuitions in one sense of the term are important to science. So it's true. If you look at scientists, they'll say things like a physicist that she has sound physical intuition, or economists routinely praise one another's economic intuitions, right? Sometimes they say that kind of stuff, but it never settles the argument. And even the intuitions of the greatest scientists are regarded by other scientists as merely useful, but not evidentially valuable. By contrast, for neo-scholastic metaphysicians, and neo-scholastics, their term of abuse here, this is very pejorative, right? Neo-scholastic metaphysicians, they're not talking about medieval metaphysicians, by the way. They're talking about current metaphysicians, but saying they're just as bad as the medieval ones. For them, intuitive judgments are typically all that ever passes for evidence. Many philosophers follow the familiar methodology of reflecting on our concepts. This is conceptual analysis, right? But why should we think that the products of this sort of analytical activity reveal anything about the deep structure of reality, rather than merely telling us about how some philosophers, or perhaps some larger reference class of people, think about and categorize reality? What if what we did was just navel gazing? We didn't actually say anything about reality in this class. All we did was just talk about us. Some metaphysicians point out that a lack of an epistemological foundation for science and mathematics does not prevent practitioners from getting on with the business of advancing the state of knowledge in these domains. So they make this comparison. Metaphysics is fine because, look, math doesn't know what its numbers are and they still go ahead and do it. Well, however, mathematics and science have undoubtedly borne fruits of great value. A priori metaphysics has achieved nothing remotely comparable, if it's achieved anything at all. So, yeah, it's true, right? Science does a few things, but you can't compare yourself to it because you haven't accomplished anything. Now, there are three ways in which analytic metaphysicians who rhetorically emulate science sometimes or often fail to follow through on their naturalistic pretense. One, they ignore science even though it seems to be relevant. Two, they use outdated or domesticated science rather than our best contemporary science. And three, they take themselves to be able to proceed a priori in the investigation of matters upon which they claim science does not bear. Physicists do not believe there are such things as good a priori grounds for holding beliefs about the constitution of the physical world. And we suggest that only a foolhardy philosopher should be willing to quarrel with them on the basis of his or her hunches. There's an example here from Peter Geach as an illustration of one being they ignore science even though it seems to be relevant. The expression at the same time, or the relation at the same time, belongs not to a special science but to logic. Our practical grasp of this logic is not to be called into question on account of recondite physics. A physicist who casts doubt upon it is sawing off the branch he sits upon. That's the quote. They think this is really bad. They think it's an instance of philosophical arrogance. I'm actually super sympathetic to this quote for what it's worth. So you can think about that on your own. It's not always straightforward to spot cases of 2 and 3 because many contemporary metaphysicians explicitly claim to be naturalists and populate their discussions with scientific examples. Unfortunately, metaphysicians seem implicitly to assume that A, outdated physics can be used as part of the explananda for metaphysics, and that B, this is acceptable because whatever the actual details of mature physics are, they will somehow be able to dock with the non-actual physics in question at some level of abstraction or generality, so that philosophers need not worry about or even pay attention to those details. So, for instance, we talk often about simples, ultimate simples, and we don't really worry what those are. Like if science ended up saying, well, they're not quarks, they're something else, still, you wave your hand and you say, whatever you people over there are going to figure out is the ultimate little thing. Keep looking, but we philosophers know it's going to bottom out at a little thing, right? Well, just like, those simples, the world is composed primarily of simples, and then you say, for instance, right, the composition problem, if you're Peter van Inwagen, you say something like, there are only simples and living things. But the simple stuff, it's like, who cares, right? There are several kinds of uses of non-actual physics regularly encountered in metaphysics. Van Inwagen assumes a Democritean image, Democritus, of the world, mereologically composed of simple atoms, that has no more in common with reality as physics describes it than does the ancient cosmology of 4 elements and perfect celestial spheres. Yet Van Inwagen does not market his work as history of ancient or early modern philosophy. It's supposed to be contemporary metaphysics. When it comes to debates about the nature of matter in contemporary metaphysics, it tends to be assumed that there are 2 possibilities. Either there are atoms in the sense of partless particles, or there is gunk in the sense of matter whose every part has proper parts, indefinitely divisible matter. So Bertrand Russell used to say there are 2 kinds of worldviews. There's 2 kinds of people: those who think the world is a bowl of jelly or a bucket of shot, right? So it's either continuous or discontinuous. If it's continuous, then you can keep dividing it into smaller parts. That's the bowl of jelly, or you think it's a bucket of shot, right? It's made of little things. So you can imagine those two worldviews side by side. They're part of this kind of a childlike metaphysics that we kind of inherit, right? The bucket of shot, here's my bucket of shot, filled with shot a little lead pebbles, like if you're shooting a BB gun, right? The world is made of little hard things. It's a bucket of little hard things, or it's a jar of jelly, right? And this is my jar, and inside the jar is this gunk, this jelly, right? And you can kind of slice it and slice it and slice it, and still you'd be left with. And then the question is, well, which is the correct view of the world? Is it made of little particles, or is it made of this kind of gunk, right? This gunk over here. And they're like, well, this debate is essentially being conducted on the same terms as it was by the pre-Socratic philosophers. It's preposterous that in spite of the developments in the scientific understanding of matter that have occurred since then, contemporary metaphysicians blithely continue to suppose that the dichotomy between atoms and gunk remains relevant and that can be addressed a priori just by thinking harder. Like you have intuitions about this, right? What do you like more, the bucket of shot or the bowl of jelly? Like if you sort of rely on your intuitions, you sit in your armchair, what would you suppose the world is made of? Jelly or pellets? Tell me, let's do a sample poll let's test our intuitions. Jelly or pellets? Pellets are not forbidden because our intuitions tell us they're conflicting. Got two jelly people. Any pellets? Any people into the pellet view? Certainly after you read this, you'd feel ashamed to say pellets. Would you agree? Like it's kind of like a demolition job on the pellets, but the gunk is also nonsense. They're taking the gunk to task as well. It's not like it's not like science is telling you it's not gel, it's not pellets, therefore it's jelly. It's neither. None of this is again, I'm going to make a big red line, and this is the view. Okay, so the purple here, that's metaphysics, and this is Ladyman and Ross's metaphysics. Bogus. Metaphysicians do not dirty their hands with such details, but instead seek to understand something more fundamental, namely the general composition relation itself. But why suppose that there is any such thing? Is it supposed to be the relation that obtains? It is supposed to be the relation that obtains between parts of any whole, but the wholes mentioned above are hugely disparate, and the composition relations studied by the special sciences are sui generis. They're their own genus. They're all unique. We have no reason to believe that an abstract composition relation is anything other than an entrenched philosophical fetish. Man, that's the language here. They start off the book, man. Like think about this. We have no reason to believe that an abstract composition relation is anything other than an entrenched philosophical fetish. If I wrote like that and try to make it in peer review, like no one, they'd be like, I got reviewed by James Ladyman once because I took him to task on some stuff. And he told me I was childish and bombastic. And I keep thinking, dude, you're the one who's childish and bombastic. Like, seriously, like you hear yourself writing? Like, it was like, I was at a conference, like I've taken on these guys. I like Don Ross more than Ladyman. Ladyman, okay, quick aside. Oh, this is recorded. I shouldn't say it. I don't like James Ladyman. So I was going to say some bad things. Right, but I'm scared it might make its way somewhere. All right, Don Ross is legit. I like Don Ross. So the Rainforest Realism paper that I put, he's legit. But Ladyman's is something that starts with a D. All right, The world for the typical metaphysician is like a pinball. Here's some more. This is another quote. I had to put this one in here. All right, read this. The world of the typical metaphysician is like a pinball machine, though anyone gripped by this image doesn't mention flashing lights or funny sound effects. That's the soundbite for this paper for this week. Like, the world of the typical metaphysician is like a pinball machine, although anyone gripped by this image doesn't mention flashing lights or funny sound effects. Can you get more disparaging than that? Like, they're going for a victory lap here. They got good arguments, but then they throw in stuff. It's great. It's hilarious. It makes for a fun read. Refusal to take seriously the implications of living in a world that has turned out to be not Newtonian is also exemplified when philosophers imagine that the strange features of quantum physics can be contained. All right, so here we go to the quantum stuff. Who was talking about quantum stuff earlier? Was it Chris? Who was it? Someone said something about quantum. Yeah, cool. All right, so here we go. Well, like, no, it's the quantum weirdness. Like, it's we got to bite the bullet. For a homely example that suffices to make the point, imagine a physicist deciding that she'll go for lunch after exactly so many clicks of the Geiger counter. So it's like philosophers simply obfuscate in pretending that the macroscopic world could be just like it is, even if there wasn't at all quantum weirdness, as if that weirdness confined itself only to the very small. Right? It's like they're saying, no, the weirdness, like if you think about it, right? Like if you have, a quantum particle instead of quantum flux or some nonsense, and it's tracked by the Geiger counter, right? And the Geiger counter is tracking this really small event, at a quantum level, and you've got a macroscopic scientist who's deciding whether or not the scientist wants to eat lunch, and they're saying, well, I'm going to base my actions on the reading of the Geiger counter. What's going to happen at this scale, right, is going to be clearly influenced by what's going to happen at this scale. So the idea that you can safely say, oh, well, all the weirdness about two things being in the same place at once or vice versa, all action at a distance, like quantum coupling. Like quantum coupling means if there's a particle in one part of the universe and there's another particle in the other part of the universe and they're quantumly coupled, like changes to one affect the other and it's action at a distance. Like with nothing, quantum entanglement, exactly. Like this weird spooky action at a distance. They're like, you have to bite the bullet, man. And it's like metaphysicians need to accept that the world is way weirder than they thought, because the results of science are that there's this weirdness happening. So it's not like metaphysicians can again rescue their pinball machine story. We cannot go back. I told you they learned their lessons from Carnap. So this comes after Carnap. We cannot go back to the anti-metaphysical stance promoted by Carnap. This book is not hostile to metaphysics. Indeed, it is an exercise in metaphysics. Remember earlier, right? They said, oh, look, we're accepting that what we're doing is we're making metaphysical presuppositions, right? Remember, there's two kinds of metaphysics, though, analytic and naturalistic. And they think the analytic one sucks, the naturalistic one is legit, right? So we can go back to anti-metaphysics. However, the kind of shady intellectual atmosphere that led thinkers like Carnap to denounce whole leading branches of the philosophy of their times as scholastic have arisen again. When philosophy becomes institutionally solipsistic, it risks making itself intellectually and culturally irrelevant. No scientist has any reason to be interested in most of the conversation that now goes under the rubric of metaphysics. And the thing I like most about this is when Carnap was harping on gobbledygook, it was continental gobbledygook. What I like most about Ladyman and Ross is they're harping on analytic gobbledygook. But that's the dominant gobbledygook in our departments, right? It's like, and they're saying it's still gobbledygook. Analytic gobbledygook is extremely annoying. If you ever want to read me taking a similar line against analytic gobbledygook, look up a paper I wrote, I don't want to say how long ago, I forget, maybe 10 years ago, a little less, called Analytic Philosophy, Continental Literature. And I say, well, analytic philosophy is full of nonsense. It's like literally full of gobbledygook, right? It just cool sounding gobbledygook, scientific sounding gobbledygook, logically appearing gobbledygook, but still gobbledygook, right? And what I like most about this is that they're not just harping on Heidegger. In fact, they let Heidegger off. Heidegger, you can go and do your thing. Just do your little thing, right? Just go on, because you're not doing metaphysics anyway. So, like, who cares? Talk about hammers all you want, right? The metaphysicians in the analytic tradition, they're the ones who are taken to task here. And I feel like it's kind of sobering because they get a free pass because they're dominant, right? When you hold the power, you're dominant. Yeah, this is the thing, right? Sumdish writes, analytic is great for brain exercise, but it rubs my intuition the wrong way. The thing is, you've seen this, Sumdish. All of the philosophy you've taken with some exceptions. Maybe if you've done some non-Western with Pouchin, or if you've done some continental with I wouldn't even know who, maybe with Pouchin, right? Or maybe with me. You've probably all done analytic. And it just sounds real cool and rigorous, but often it's just nonsense. It really is just nonsense. A lot of it just is. Right, and I like the fact that they're taking to task the analytic tradition here. I find it refreshing. So because I'm tired of hearing people harping on the continental tradition. It's an easy target, right? And often they don't even know what they're talking about. They haven't read it, so it's like that's kind of annoying. At least you get the sense they read the analytic metaphysicians. All right. So one of the things they want to do in this paper is two things: the destructive and the positive part. Now they get to the positive part. So we've done the destructive part. Now they're going to do some positive stuff. it's not going to be as developed. I'm going to go through this one a little quicker. So let us now move on to sketch these so our positive remarks, right? After first stating the conditions under which we think that positive metaphysics can be appropriately motivated. Yeah, Peirce. Yeah, this is the thing with Peirce, though. They're going to say things about Peirce because one of their guys is a Peirce guy, John Collier, but there are elements of their scientism. Okay, so Arjun, you took Peirce with me, am I right? Like, who's taking, so folks are taking Peirce with me, say yes. All right. Okay, so, yeah, okay. Do you think Peirce, let's go back to the title of this thing. I'm at slide 19, let's go back to this thing. What do you think that Peirce would ever be in defense of scientism? Like, take the current state of science and worship it. Yes or no? If you've heard anything, listen to anything from my class. There's no way. Peirce would be turning in his grave if he knew that his name was mentioned in a chapter called In Defense of Scientism, which is taking the latest result and saying it's the, well, not it's the shit. Like I was going to say, it's all done, right? But there's some elements in Peirce that are so different. And I'm a Peirce scholar, so I'm mentioning the name here just so you know. There's elements of Peirce they get right, but some other elements they don't. Just want you to know. So according to them, though, note that we align our attitude more closely with that of Charles Sanders Peirce and pragmatism. And fair enough, because if you're looking for an alternative, and it's a nice segue to what I just said, if you think of the Western philosophy as being continental, analytic, and tradition, and you're saying, well, I'm definitely not going to do continental, and I also think that analytic is gobbledygook, you're kind of left with pragmatism. It's that or you go non-Western. And it's not like you're going to find a lot in non-Western that's going to not sound gobbledygook, because non-Western, newsflash, it's replete with gobbledygook. Like, you want gobbledygook? It's a fountain of gobbledygook, right? So they're going to go for pragmatism. So the continental tradition, analytic, and American pragmatist. So basically, they're like, non-Western is not even a thing because we're not going to go there. It's not going to be continental. It's not going to be analytic. So we're going to do pragmatism. And it kind of makes some sense so far as it goes, right? Yeah, that's the thing is, yeah, Sundish, you're right. So if you've taken Peirce with me, you're going to be in a position to spot if and when they'd have misunderstandings of him. I don't have the parts where they make the biggest misunderstandings. I didn't put in this reading. I cut them out. But Sundish, hold on to your armchair. They say that we should consider true any theory that receives a lot of funding. At one point in their chapter, they say this. So hold on to your armchair. Sundish, what do you think? Do you think Peirce would be turning in his grave? If a theory receives funding, we consider it legitimate because of its funding. The funding tracks truth. Show me where the money goes. Man, he'd smack his forehead. This was the man who died of starvation because he couldn't get $1, right? And here you have these people saying, follow the money. Follow the money. I didn't put that part in. But any of you, if you want to read the whole thing and you've taken Peirce with me, yeah. So those of you, by the way, who don't know who the hell we're talking about, Charles Sanders Peirce is the American Aristotle. So, like, Aristotle was arguably the best and smartest person who's ever lived ever. Well, we've got another one, Peirce. So, yeah, and I'm a Peirce guy. So, a lot of a Peirce guy. Like, I work a lot on Peirce, but yeah. And I teach a third-year course on Peirce occasionally. So take that with me if you want to know. But it's epiphenomenal in this case. Your lack of familiarity with Charles Sanders Peirce is not going to affect anything in your reading. Yeah, Arjun, take that course. That'd be a good thing. Yeah, it was a dope class. I agree. Do you remember when we built the universe, Arjun? From chance. A chance-based universe. Do you remember that? I have a lot of happy moments, right? I have a lot of happy moments, but this was one of them. My friends, together we built the laws of nature in our laboratory using only chance and love. Yeah, and love. Oh my God. It was crazy. Oh, it was so cool. Well, take all my classes. I love all you kids. You're good kids. I want to see you in all my classes. So you can't double dip and take Peirce again, but for what it's worth. All right, so let's keep reading. This is the positive account now. So what might a responsible and significant job for metaphysics, what might be a responsible and significant job for metaphysics to do? Our answer is that one of the most important things we want from science is a relatively unified picture of the world. We do not assert this as a primitive norm. Rather, we claim that it is exemplified in the actual history of science. Metaphysics, as we will understand it here, I'm changing my voice now because it's like, now they're saying their kinds of metaphysics. And they're not going to be as vicious. So metaphysics, as we understand it here, is the enterprise of critically elucidating consilience networks across the science. So they have work for metaphysics to do. Remember, Carnap thought, what's the work of philosophy to do? So once you've destroyed metaphysics and you say metaphysics is bogus, what should philosophy be doing according to Carnap? Yeah, Carl, that's right. Sort out the logical truths, the empirical truths, and the nonsense. And the activity of sorting it out was called what? And that gave rise to the tradition that we were talking about a moment ago. The activity of sorting out those different propositions, so logical propositions, empirical propositions, and nonsense, analytic philosophy. So it's the analysis, so conceptual analysis, right? And the thing is, on the grave of that, so according to Carnap, what you should do, so the Shema is, it's not going to be metaphysics, so it's going to be analytic philosophy, so called as AP, right? But out of that came analytic metaphysics. This is a nice schema, very macroscopic schema, captures a lot of what's happened. So Carnap says it ought not to be metaphysics, so then it became analytic philosophy, and out of analytic philosophy grew out analytic metaphysics. And now I'm going to put in purple James and Ladyman and Don Ross's view. What we ought to do is not analytic metaphysics, but what? Someone fill that in for me. Naturalistic metaphysics. Yeah, so sorry for the fat marker. Hopefully that makes sense. So Carnap says it shouldn't be metaphysics. Call this good old-fashioned metaphysics. The metaphysics of, we've got a Schopenhauer fan, a metaphysics of Neoplatonism, metaphysics of Heidegger, right? Then we should be doing analytic philosophy. But in analytic philosophy, this AP here, according to Carnap, there was no metaphysics in it. No metaphysics. It was a Tupperware container. The bottom one was epistemology. You took out completely the metaphysical container. But then this kind of resurfaced, right? Because we can't help ourselves. It's just so cool. So David Lewis, Quine, Putnam, Kripke start to do this analytic metaphysics, and they're thinking, now that's become bogus again, and now we got to do naturalistic metaphysics. That should be not NM. Sorry, that should be NM. N, not naturalistic. NM. Does that make sense? Is that clear, everyone? Everything in red is Carnap. Everything in purple is Ladyman and Ross. All right. Since science just is our set of institutional error filters for the job of discovering the objective character of the world, that and no more, but also and no less. This is a bad sentence. That and no more, but also that and no less. Science respects no domain restrictions and will admit no epistemological rivals. This is a big sentence. I mean, think of what they're saying here, right? Science, they could rephrase this a bit better, right? It's just, to my mind, it just doesn't snap as much. Science respects no domain restrictions and will admit no epistemological rivals. With respect to anything that is a putative fact about the world, scientific institutional processes are absolutely and exclusively authoritative, right? And the institutional part is where Peirce would have some problems. Peirce would say this. So if you want to get to know Peirce a little bit, even those of you who don't know this, Peirce would say everything except this word, right? So if you look at this quote over here, with respect to anything that is a putative fact about the world, scientific processes are absolutely and exclusively authoritative. And then he'd add, provided that they stand ready to be revised, or some nonsense, right? Like this, some continue like that. It's not nonsense, but really good. But the institutional part is the one he'd sign off on. He'd be like, no, get me off this bandwagon. Yeah. The thing is, no, not for Peirce, right? So Peirce would be able to say scientific processes without saying institutionalism, because for Peirce, science is a love of truth. So you're a scientist the moment you've committed to truth. You've been taken on the scientific mindset, right? And the institutions are great as checks on your errors. So you want other people to proof you. You want other people to corroborate your results. Yeah. But the moment you express the love of truth and you've made, I would almost say, like a religious commitment. And Peirce describes it in quasi-religious terms. We saw this very early on when we studied Peirce. The institutional part he'd actually be suspicious of, because that's when it gets scientific. It can get rigorous, right? It can kind of rigidify into a body of dogmas, and it becomes now dogmatic. And that's the part he would be against, right? So there's elements of Peirce in here, but there's elements of non-Peirce. Like this is where, if you want to kind of flesh out, the institutions can sometimes become, like for instance, look, Peirce what would Peirce's view be on research into alternatives to COVID vaccines? Would he say it's good to look into those possibilities or not good? Good or not good? COVID alternatives, vaccine alternatives. He'd love it. He'd be like, inquire. Do not block the way of inquiry. Like, why are you getting married to one particular, like, you might be wrong. How the hell do you know, right? It's like, leave space, make provisions for the possibility that you're being wrong. Do not ever censor a hypothesis. Yeah, that's his fallibilism. So if you have, let's say, Big Pharma saying you have to take this vaccine and it's the only truth and we'll shut down your account if you even suggest whatever, an alternative, person would be like, no, man, what the hell is wrong with you? A real scientist would look into ivermectin, whatever, right? And then we'll let the truth fall where it may. We'll kind of sort it out, but you don't censor people. And the institutional stuff he'd be really concerned with. Yeah, so this is where he's not a scientist. He's not into scientism. They're into scientism, full on. And here's the scientism right here in that word. That's the scientism right here, right? In defense of scientism. With respect to anything that is a putative fact about the world, right? Scientific institutional processes are absolutely and exclusively authoritative. That means no job for you metaphysicians. Exclusively means no anything else than that, right? So it's like metaphysicians, you're out of a job, right? In that sense, I would be out of a job unless I did the work that they say I ought to be doing, right? Which is to unify the sciences, to sort of bring it together, and we'll clarify that as we close now. Scientific reasoning is a community enterprise. That's a very Peircean thought. So here they say with Peirce, we emphasize that. Scientific reasoning is a community enterprise. True. Sound metaphysics should be concerned with sound metaphysics. We should be concerned with our substantial bodies of scientific results taken together rather than individual claims taken one at a time. That's our milkshake. Everybody remember the milkshake a couple weeks ago? Say yes if you do, no if you don't. I give you a milkshake. Put a bunch of stuff, and I say, you'll get better. And you say, what got me better? Something in there, right? Something in there, yeah. And so this is the view, right? All the scientific results taken together rather than individual claims taken one at a time. That's the milkshake. That's the milkshake of pragmatism, right? So individuals, and this is very Peircean, individuals are blessed with no epistemological anchor points, neither uninterpreted sense data, nor reliable hunches about what stands to reason. The epistemic supremacy of science rests on repeated iteration of institutional filter errors. This is very Peircean. Institutional, he'd say sort of collective or communal, but this is very Peircean. There's no privileged sort of anchor point, a Cartesian axiom, right, that you get to have. And here are these now paragraph length statements of the architecture of their positive account. Any new metaphysical claim that is to be taken seriously should be motivated by, and only by, the service it would perform, if true, in showing how two or more specific scientific hypotheses jointly explain more than the sum of what is explained by the two hypotheses taken separately, where a scientific hypothesis is understood as a hypothesis that is taken seriously by institutionally bona fide current science. This is where the funding part comes in. Right, so like you have to sort of sort out what a scientific hypothesis is, and they'd be like, well, look at the funding. So that's the part where show me the money, right? But this is an account of their positive view. So it has to unify at least two or more specific scientific hypotheses, which jointly explain more than the sum of what is explained by the two hypotheses taken separately. So that's one of their statements of their positive view. Also, what they call the principle of naturalistic closure. Any new metaphysical claim that is to be taken seriously at time t should be motivated by, and only by, the service it would perform, if true, in showing how two or more specific scientific hypotheses, at least one of which is drawn from fundamental physics, jointly explain more than the sum of what is explained by the two hypotheses taken together separately. So the thing is like this, right? So you've got, let's say, a bunch of different sciences, right? A bunch of different sciences. Let all of these be different sciences. And notice they're not really talking to each other because they're all specialized in doing their own thing. So these are all sciences. And we could put letters in there, right? I'm going to have some fun. I'm going to put biology over here. B, I'm going to put chemistry over here. C, I'm going to put economics over here. E, I'm going to put sociology over here. S, presumably if it was done scientifically. I'm going to put physics over here. P, I'm going to put whatever, right? Name me another, whatever, zoology, right? So whatever, suggestions, design. All right, let's put design. If that could be it. Well, design is that normative concept. All right, astronomy. Cool, astronomy. Metaphysics then does this job according to their picture. You've got to unify at least two, and at least one has to be connected to physics. So there's a kind of that's the second constraint here, what they call the principle of naturalistic closure. At least one of them has to be physics. That's their positive picture of what metaphysics ought to be doing, is those purple things. At least two hypotheses have been strung together in a way that sheds light on them more than the sum of their parts, and it has to be at least one connected to physics. Using ideas about patterns from Dennett, so this is the paper I put on Moodle if you want to have a look at it, Real Patterns, one of the papers I love the most. This book is an effort to justify generalizations about the wide scope metaphysical structure of the world that does not rely on the intuition that the world comes in levels. Now, we've said harsh things about current metaphysics. We see no point in mincing words. It seems to us to be just a ridiculous when philosophers look up from their desks and tell us that while sitting there and concentrating, they've discovered, usually all by themselves, facts about the nature of the world that compete with the fruits of ingenious experimentation conducted under competitive pressure and organized by complex institutional processes. The individual philosophers are generally not crazy, but quirks in history and culture and structure of the modern academy have encouraged crazy activity and hidden its absurdity. The scientist seeks truth to some extent, but all that should be meant by this is that she must be careful never to report, as sincerely held beliefs about her domain, claims that she thinks are merely hunches. By contrast, the metaphysician has no test for the truth of her beliefs, except that other metaphysicians can't think of obviously superior alternative beliefs. When we discover that scientific theories are not exactly true, this should occasion no deep angst or regret. Scientific theories have multiple possible sources of value, which they had to demonstrate to have ever attracted significant investment in the first place. It's much less obvious that a false metaphysical theory is good for anything. For these reasons, we admire science to the point of frank scientism. My friends, how did you enjoy this paper? Chris says, I feel like it addressed something that bothered me when I was going over Carnap. Yeah. And you definitely need to reread. Thanks, Sasha. I really appreciate it. I appreciate folks thinking it was so helpful, because that's what I'm here to do, right? To help you. First of all, I digested the text. So the chapter is supposed to be 60 pages, single space, size 11. That's the point. That's why we want to come to class, right? Class has to offer you something different, right, than what you could do on your own, right? Yeah, cool. Well, look, cool. There's a pragmatism in there in their positive account, and it's interesting to see in what parts it sort of connects and disconnects with classical pragmatism, especially as the sort you find in Peirce, which I'm confessing, like I've grown to be a big believer of. Wasn't always, by the way. So early on in my academic or intellectual trajectory as a philosopher, I really had issues with a lot of things. But eventually I kind of, and who knows, I might change my mind, right? But this is where kind of, as a Peirce guy, obviously this is different. But you can see here the story about metaphysics. And notice what they've learned from Carnap. Like, what could we say they've summarized? If you had to summarize, what have we learned from Carnap? How is this different from Carnap? That's where I want, probably a good place for starting our discussion with whatever time we have remaining. In what ways is this different from Carnap? Like, because this is not just more of the same. It's a wrecking ball, but it's doing something different. Let's brainstorm. Let's list a bunch of stuff. Just very briefly, like, how is this different from Carnap? Let's now go to sort of a conversation mode. It's saying that to do naturalist metaphysics instead of just stop. That's right. Metaphysics can still be viable. I'm going to write that. Metaphysics can still be viable, albeit in only one version, namely theirs. Rejection of intuition and presupposition. Yeah, it's not like the whole talk. They talk about intuitions, so that's not something that Carnap never talked about, right? Talk about intuition and their merit, right? Intuitions. Talk about intuition was not on Carnap's radar at all. Like, that wasn't on his radar. Like, that doesn't show up, right? In fact, he's got some intuitions. Carnap's got some strong intuitions about what you see when you look out in the world, right? The protocol senses, and right. Also, would you agree their language is completely irrelevant to this critique? Like the quirks of our grammar, right? They mentioned very briefly that English talks about like solid objects, and we acquire that around 3, but like language is irrelevant. Would you agree with that point? Like for them, that's not a thing. Like it's not, you don't see an analysis of language in there. Like, well, look, you see this sentence and they analyze it through logic. Logic is also irrelevant. Would you agree? Like logic is irrelevant to their critique. Like, and I say irrelevant doesn't mean it's bad. Like it's just not used, right? So what I mean by that is not used in their critique. Same thing with logic. It's not like, yeah, not used in their critique, which means that a little more abstract in their critique. They presuppose, by the way, they don't actually, not in the parts that I left, they presuppose that you should read up, and they've read up on the latest physics, right? Enough to know that this micro banging of little things picture is bogus, but we'll have to take their word for it. At least in the parts that I've given you, it's not like they do that nitty gritty stuff. Another way in which they're different from Carnap, would you agree that Carnap had levels versus no levels, right? Levels versus no levels. I have to take it on faith. Actually, this is the thing with Carnap, right? So Carnap, because he was talking about language, could actually provide the sort of demonstrations in his articles, whereas they have to say, look to the latest science, and the latest science in 2007 will be, by the time we're reading it now, different, right? So it would have been kind of a fool's errand anyways, right? Like imagine they did the latest strings theory, you know, the gobbledygook of natural science and physics. Like by the time we're studying it in 2022, that whole part would be like probably superseded, right? Levels versus no levels. That's the Carnap versus them, right? Notice the picture, by the way, that I made earlier. The picture that I did where all the sciences, and notice I put physics not like this at any particular spot. Like there's these two pictures of levels versus no levels, right? So like for them, physics, let me put a P here. Let's see if I can do a little P. I feel like Bob Ross when I do this. This is physics and this is physics, right? For Carnap, right? Physics is at the bottom of a kind of a scale reduction thing, right? For them, it's like these entertain information theoretic relations with one another, and because they're all tracking patterns, right? I don't know much about quantum mechanics, but I assume that what they're using to encourage is the question. Yeah, so quantum weirdness wasn't in Carnap at all. That doesn't even show up in Carnap. Do we agree? There's the whole talk of that Carnap wasn't bothered by quantum weirdness. That wasn't not on Carnap's radar, not on Carnap's radar, right? Because that wasn't a thing as much, right? It was kind of beginning to be a thing. But like the weirdness, although I don't think they bite the bullet for the weirdness as much. So they mentioned we need to revise our world to make it weird, right? Yeah, the quantum. Thank you, Sumdish, for just bringing up the quantum stuff, right? Also, so the no levels, no. What else could we think? So let's review here. Metaphysics can still be viable, albeit only in one version. Talk about intuition. Was not on Carnap's radar. That should be a T over here. Come on, where's my pen? All right, here we go. Language is irrelevant, or at least not used in their critique. Logic's not used in their critique. It's not levels. It's this thing. This is a big. This is not as apparent in the reading, right? But Ladyman and Ross, right? So Ladyman and Ross think the stuff. And it's not a stuff, precisely, of the world is patterns versus the ultimate stuff that you're going to get in Carnap. Can anyone venture what's the ultimate stuff that Carnap's going to appeal to? Sense data, right? The given. Remember you talked about the given? We can disagree about what the given is, but there's a given, like this gray patch here now that I see, right? And one of the things also that leads to this distinction, by the way, is because they're going in this There's another thing that doesn't show up on Carnap's radar that shows up in theirs, and that's, again, not apparent from the reading that we had, is information theory. So patterns are informational compressions. So what you do is you see a pattern and you describe it in a way that occupies less informational entropy than the thing that you were describing. So let me give you an example. Suppose I ask you to write this. So let's do some information theory for a second. Let's talk about patterns for a second. Let's imagine, right? Let's imagine that I asked you to text this. Hold on. Where's my... Okay, imagine I asked you to text this thing that I've put in the box here. Let me give myself a box. All right, text what's in this box to your friend. Use your phone with as few characters as possible. What would you text your friend? And I'm just going to count them for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. There's 36 B's, by the way. What would you text your friend? You want them to be able to reproduce this with as small as text message as possible. Sumdish writes A, B times 36, and then C. Chris writes A, open brackets. Yeah, so notice Sumdish is what Sumdish wrote. Look, notice what Chris wrote, right? Look how many characters are there. Let's just take Chris. Even if Chris uses parentheses, 1 is for A. So let's write Chris's. Chris wrote the following: A, open brackets, B times 36, and then C. Close brackets and then C. All right, let's count. Let me use a different marker now. Okay. Let's count how many characters that Chris used, because different formulations can be. Arjun's got another one. Yeah, not bad, right? 1. Let's count 1 for the bracket. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 characters. So Chris, right, sent a message of 8 characters. How many characters are in here? So I said there were 36 B's. How many characters are in here? 38. So what we've done is we've done informational compression. We were able to represent the same object, namely the content of the box, by means of abstracting out the pattern. This is where the story about patterns comes in, right? And this is where information theory comes in. Their full story of what the world is that the world is a bunch of patterns. The world was A, B, 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 if you will, and then C. And science consists in saying things like this. And why science works is because it compresses patterns. All sciences do this. The physics do it. The zoologists do it. The chemists do it. Every scientist is in the business of informational compression. And they're capable of compressing information because the world is made of patterns, right? And so essentially what you're doing when you're saying something like E equals MC square, it's exactly, they're saying the world is made of statistics all the way down, essentially. Like it's exactly what they're saying, Carl. This is their positive view of the world, right? If you say E equals MC square, what you're doing is you're compressing, right? It's like zipping a file. You know, a zipped file takes less space, right? And you're compressing all the information that you see because the world is replete with patterns, and the motion of the bodies that you observe are themselves patterned. And so sciences are in the business of compressing patterns. That's not at all sort of the empiricist story about sense data that you get in Carnap. My friends, you like that? We're able to say in 8 characters a 38 character long string. Would you think that's cool? That's what we do. So Einstein was basically staring at the world, trying to discern a pattern. Like he was staring at this, right? So you can imagine, right? Science stares at this pattern, which is the pattern in the world, and tries to see what unifies it, right? Like you can imagine if I gave you another pattern, right? Imagine I did this. Let's have some fun with patterns for a second, right? If you had to convey this, what would you do? and as few characters as possible. Yeah, exactly. So Chris writes, okay, so look at what Chris did. So Chris is now trying to compress this, right? So he's zipping the file. So let's see what Chris's zipped file looks like. Chris said ABC times 5. Now, how many characters is on the right? Well, we can count them, right? So we can actually measure mathematically the informational compression. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got 5 characters here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15. And so when you go one way, it's like you're unzipping a file, you're decompressing the information, right, and compressing it. So compression and decompression are represented by these 2 arrows here, right? And the world is information. The world is comprised of our informational relation with patterns. And that's the positive story they're going to say. Now, of course, that's not at all like Carnap, by the way. And you could only have written that in 2007. Because everything I'm saying right now is a holdover of information theory, which only sort of really started to become rigorously organized after Claude Shannon's 1940s classic papers on information theory, right? So it's a completely different worldview. By the way, I love this worldview. So just so you know, all this stuff about information theory and patterns, if you sat me down and you said, Mark, what's your story of reality? That would be part of my story of reality. I've grown to really love that story. I don't buy their version of it 100%, but I'm a fan. That's why I'm sharing you the sort of other material that I did, the real pattern stuff, right? My friends, is that clear and cool? Tell me, how do you feel about all this? Was that helpful? They got a cooler story than I've led on, right? So we're only kind of focused on their critique of metaphysics, but they are replacing this with something. Yeah. They're replacing it with something. Have we missed something? So let's review here the stuff. Metaphysics can still be viable, unlike Carnap. The talk of intuitions, that's not at all on Carnap's radar. Chris, I'm going to agree. Language is not really relevant to their critique. Logic's not really used in their critique. There's no levels. It's this kind of weird, information theoretic, or what Ross in another paper calls rainforest realism. Quantum weirdness, that wasn't on Carnap's radar. That's a thing. They've got the information theory, and they talk about patterns as opposed to sense data. Is there something else? Can you spot another difference between the reading that we did and the Carnap one? Like, how is there something further? I would say also maybe, I don't know. I just occurred to me one. The whole art stuff maybe was a little more generous with Carnap, right? Carnap had more of the story. Right, I'm gonna say Carnap art ... The whole idea of expression of your worldview in a artistic medium, that kind of stuff, that wasn't at all there. It just showed up really briefly, but like Carnap respects that a bit more. Like, I don't know that you'd have a lot of love for art. Yeah, there's a kind of Carnap, and so let's put respect, right? There's more respect, although there's some respect here for like Heidegger can do his thing. Oh, and another issue is, well, Heidegger, how do we view Heidegger? Right, Carnap says Heidegger does bad metaphysics, and they say Heidegger doesn't even do metaphysics. So that's an interesting distinction, right? It's like Carnap says Heidegger's doing bad metaphysics, right? And the whole question of Heidegger, and they're saying Heidegger's not even doing metaphysics. Go ahead, do it, have fun, do your little thing. It's like cosplay. Well, cosplay, what do I care about cosplay? They're not doing metaphysics. It's like you stick a microphone in Ladyman and Ross's face, and what do you think about the latest cosplay? Dressing up as some sort of anime, and they're like, but what do I care? It's not metaphysics. It's not pretending to track reality. So I don't have an opinion either way. So they view Heidegger as cosplay. It's like, who cares, right? We're still brainstorming. The argument is because he deals with things. First of all, there's 2 reasons why Heidegger wasn't doing metaphysics according to them. One, by definition for them, metaphysics has to do with science, and Heidegger was anti-science. So there you go, right? Especially the late Heidegger. But Heidegger was non-science and then later anti-science, or certainly anti-technology. But he's always been anti-science. So he's a romanticist. There's a lot of he just loved folk music and walks in the park. It's a different it's not at all Ladyman and Ross. And the second reason is, look at all of the examples. They're things. And they're saying everything must go. Like, he starts with our dealings with things, especially man-made things. Like, it's for a 3-year-old, right? Or an adult dealing with stuff, coping practically with the environment. So yeah. And also another figure that we might put on this list, by the way, Peirce, this Peirce is a thing in a way that he couldn't have been for Carnap. Because Peirce's papers took a while for us to kind of wrap our minds around. And even though Peirce predates Carnap, the interpretation of Peirce took about a century to get off the ground. So our knowledge of Peirce, the American Aristotle, that couldn't have been on Carnap's radar at all. It would have changed everything. If Carnap would have spent time, the reason why Carnap, okay, I'm going to end on this note. You know why Quine and Carnap are different is because Quine was hired as a grad student to work through the Peirce papers at Harvard. And he came out of the basement and he was like a changed man, right? When he was raised by Carnap, it was like, which sentence matches with which fact? It's a one-to-one match, right? The cat is on the mat, if and only if the cat is on the mat. And then you look and you've got the proposition, the cat is on the mat. And then you match or mismatch with whether or not the cat is on the mat. And then he's like, no, that's not at all how it works, man. You make a milkshake and you muddle through. That's what it is. And if your milkshake sucks, then maybe you go back and you change your recipe. And if it doesn't suck, you keep sticking with it. Like, and that's what Quine, you know, the influence that Peirce had on Quine. I'm doing some history of philosophy, but it's a really cool anecdote and it's true. Very low resolution story, but it's true. My friends, I'm going to say we did what we wanted to do today. Was this fun? Did you have fun? We did a critique of metaphysics based on science. Did you have a fun class?